Hello, Starshine. My name is Liz, and this is my channel, Simsational Stories. If you have not seen my videos before, and you enjoy this one, please like and subscribe, and maybe check out my other social media as well. I'm on both Facebook and Twitter. All relevant links are in the description below, and of course, if you're a Sims player and you'd like to download any of my characters, just search the hashtag Simsational Stories on the Sims 4 gallery. All original content is created by This Is Not Eric. Finally, before I begin my Simsational story, I'd like to issue this blanket content and trigger warning. The following story is just Sims, hey. I'm not going to apologise for treating them terribly, if that's what I've done. But I do want to assure you now that although I mean absolutely no harm, I completely understand if you feel unable to consume my content. Many loves, and we will catch each other on the internet elsewhere. Okay, so now we've gotten that over with. Let's go. Today's story is a historical interlude, which is a thing I do. It's like, okay, so basically it's a standalone chapter of history for a particular world or story, and I'll be adding this video to both the playlist for the overall story it relates to, as well as to an individual playlist of historical interludes. Does that make sense? I hope so, because without further ado, let me introduce you to Ruby and Rose. Fraternal twins Ruby and Rose Fournier are young adults that have just moved to a small, stylish apartment in the up-and-coming neighbourhood of Evergreen Harbour. Despite looking almost exactly identical, the twins do have one major physical difference. Outgoing and creative Ruby has light like amethyst violet eyes, while serious and introverted sister Rose was blessed with bright ocean blue eyes. Their parents had always encouraged them to embrace their differences, and as a result, their being twins was only a small part of their identity. Rose was an aspiring caterer who dreamed of owning her own restaurant, while Ruby had bold hopes of making it big one day as a famous comedian and entertainer. Ruby would go out most nights, travelling to every neighbourhood open mic night she could find to practice and hone her skills on stage. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes she felt so shy, standing up there all alone in front of everyone. But she didn't let her anxiety stop her. Ruby was stronger than that. She only wished she could find that very same strength she found on stage to overcome her nervousness when it came to talking to men. She even had a bit about it. After all, it was a little funny. She could stand up in front of a whole group of strangers, introduce herself, and start making them all laugh. Yet she couldn't do the same alone with a man at the bar? No, she could not. Inevitably, at the end of almost every night, Ruby Fournier would find herself finishing her wine all alone. She'd lost count of how many times she'd struck out. It wasn't fair, and it didn't make any sense. Ruby wasn't an idiot. She knew that she and her sister were both beautiful women, and yet, somehow, they were both still single. Rose wasn't as worried about their still being single as Ruby was. They were only young. There was still plenty of time for all of that later. What they should be focusing on right now was themselves, not men. Rose had been on a bit of a health kick lately. It sort of went hand in hand with being a cook. And she had discovered that she loved working out. She had even joined the local gym, and it was crazy how soon after that happened that Rose Fournier suddenly started thinking about men in a whole different way. It had been one thing to abstractly rebuff the idea of dating, but it was a whole other thing to try to ignore the cute guy she walked past every single day. Especially when he came over before yoga class and introduced himself to you. Blanchard Bridges was a friendly guy, and he never missed an opportunity to get to know a new woman. In fact, Blanchard had himself a little bit of a reputation around Evergreen Harbour as an unabashed, repugnant bachelor. It was a reputation well earned and well deserved. But of course, Rose didn't know this. She and her sister Ruby were new to town, and Blanchard was the first person Rose had even met outside of work. He seemed nice enough, definitely cute, and so when he asked her out for a drink after her workout, she couldn't help but say yes. They didn't even have to go far. Their gym had a little bit of a bar. It also sold protein shakes, of course, but Blanchard quickly ordered her an apple nectar and began asking her about herself. How old was she? Had they just committed a crime giving her some nectar? She was 22, she laughed back at him, and more than capable of making her own decisions. Looking back at that day later, though, she wasn't sure what had prompted her to make that decision. She'd never done anything like that before in her life. Rose had always been the good one out of her and Ruby, but there was just something so irresistible about Blanchard, and when he kissed her, Ruby felt herself lose all control. Before she knew it, Blanchard had led her by the hand down the hall to the bathroom, and they were ducking into a shower stall together. He may have led the way, but Rose was just as into the moment as he was. His gasping breath against her neck drove her wild, and she was the one who pulled him into that steamy cloud of hot, wet air. Rose didn't tell her sister about what she'd done at the gym that morning. She wasn't sure Ruby would even believe her if she did try to talk about it. But it was more than that. Ruby, and everyone else, had always thought of herself as the interesting twin. But now Rose finally had something interesting that had happened to her, and she really just wanted to keep it to herself, for a little while at least. Only one other person knew what had happened in that gym bathroom, and for Blanchard, it had almost been a non-event. He hooked up with lots of women, and never thought twice about it. Unless he saw them again, like he did this one. Her hair was styled a little differently, and he thought her eyes had been blue, not purple. But it was definitely the same girl. He wasted even less time that night with her than they had the morning before. Within 5 minutes of finding her on the dance floor, Blanchard had Ruby in his arms in the dark shadows of the club, with his tongue all the way down her throat. She barely had time to breathe. Who was this delicious stranger? Ruby wasn't complaining, though. This was exactly what she had been looking for someone to do with her for months now. Finally! This was amazing. She happily followed him home to his spacious apartment and down the hall into his bedroom without a second thought. And things quickly progressed physically from there. It was her first one-night stand ever, and Ruby was unsure the next morning whether or not they'd used protection, but she didn't want to ask. She wanted to seem worldly and experienced, not nervous and unsure like she really felt on the inside. Instead, Ruby kissed her new lover boldly goodbye, before saying she'd better get back home to her twin sister. Blanchard had perked up at that. Twin sister? She was a twin. That was hot. Did she have any pictures of her twin? Could he see them? Once again, Ruby didn't think twice, and happily scrolled him through a few recent pictures. Blanchard had just been joking, but he quickly realized his good fortune. He pictured it in his head immediately. Twins! It was like a moist dream. He'd slept with twins, and within days of one another at that. imagine if he could get them both there together and then sleep with them again. It was every man's fantasy, and Blanchard certainly fantasized about it within an instant of his realization. It would never happen, though. Blanchard hadn't told Ruby that he had been with her sister. He had just sent her home with a fake number to text. And just like Rose hadn't mentioned her own one-night stand, Ruby, in turn, didn't tell her sister what she'd done. After all, it was nobody's business but her own, and nobody would ever have to know. Or so Ruby thought, until the morning sickness began. Oh, how she regretted not asking Blanchard if they'd use protection now. Obviously they hadn't for this to happen. Gosh, what a disaster this was. Ruby never really talked about it much with anyone, but she absolutely hated children. And now she was going to be having one. It was a nightmare. Ruby had worried that her twin sister Rose would decide to leave her alone with this sudden, unexpected plot twist. But all Rose wanted to know was who the father was. Neither Ruby nor Rose had ever really had a boyfriend before. So how had this happened? She was absolutely horrified when she heard the name Blanchard, though. Surely it couldn't be. It was true, though. Twins Ruby and Rose Fournier had both slept with bachelor Blanchard Bridges within days of one another, and now Ruby was pregnant with his child. And worse, as he was now explaining to them both, was that he would have nothing to do with it. Blanchard had already been married and abandoned his first family over a year ago, and this would be no different. He had no wish to be a father. Well, Ruby didn't want to be a mother, did she? It was too late for that, for either of them. It was happening. But as Rose angrily told Blanchard, if he didn't want to be a father to this child, then fine. That was just fine. He was a disgusting, reprehensible, repugnant Sim, whose children were all probably far better off without him anyway. Certainly this child was better off without Blanchard. Knowing her twins' inherent secret aversion to children, Rose set the nursery up in her own bedroom. She would take care of the night feeds and whatever else. It was Ruby's baby, of course, but Rose had promised her sister that she wouldn't have to do this alone, and she meant to keep that promise. They had done everything else in life thus far together, and as such, twins Ruby and Rose Fournier were about to become parents. And that brings us to the end of Ruby and Rose's historical interlude. If you've enjoyed this little story, I strongly recommend that, first, you like and subscribe, of course, but also that you go and check out the playlists on my page to see where this tiny bit of history fits in. Also, maybe check out my Facebook page. Okay, that's it. Bye!